Hello, everybody. Amidst all the chaos, we seem to have forgotten one of the big stories of a couple of weeks ago, the supposed closure of TikTok. The headlines now is that Trump apparently wants the TikTok deal. And there's all sorts of talk of how it would work. The bigger story, though, I think is, and I've talked about this in the past, is the implications of Americans not being allowed to use TikTok. My guest today on the show had an excellent piece in The Atlantic a couple of weeks ago, commenting on this. It's entitled, "America is no longer the home of the free internet, how the United States learned to love internet censorship." It's by the great internet liberal, I wouldn't call him a libertarian, Ethan Zuckerman, who teaches at the University of Massachusetts and is joining us from Amherst today. Ethan, what would you describe yourself politically? Would you think of yourself as a digital liberal, libertarian?
No, I'm pretty comfortable with progressive. I'm pretty far left, and at a university that proudly features a heterodox economics department, which is at least half Marxist, and very, very happy to take the left position on a lot of these things. When it comes to issues of online speech, I don't position myself as a free speech absolutist, but I am someone who's done lots and lots of work on trying to preserve people's ability to speak online, particularly people who are facing government repression. And that's sort of where my history is working with people in controlled speech environments in China, in Iran, Saudi Arabia, so on and so forth. Co-founder of an organization called Global Voices Online, which has been trying to amplify people's voices from around the world. And all of that sort of led me to this moment of, this is so strange. We used to try to get people to speak on US platforms because that was a good way to protect their ability to reach global audiences. And now suddenly the US government is trying to prevent Americans from accessing this very popular platform. This just seems like a very fundamental contradiction of American First Amendment values.
Yeah, there was an interesting piece today on the Hill about a Texan Republican apparently who expressed his regret for voting to ban TikTok. But one of the things that astonishes me is the muted response broadly to the banning of TikTok, or the intention to ban TikTok, and the Supreme Court decision to suggest that it was legal, banning TikTok in the US. Why is that? Why aren't people more outraged, Ethan?
Well, I think the obvious answer to that one, Andrew, is that there's so much to be outraged about right now that I feel almost ashamed to be talking about TikTok at the moment, right? I could be talking about getting rid of USAID. I could be talking about the damage to legal immigration in the United States. There is this moment where it is a little difficult to pay much attention to anything. But I think that Americans of all political stripes have gotten very, very skeptical of social media. I think some of that skepticism is warranted. I think some of that skepticism is exaggerated and based on poor research. And I think in many ways, the further a social media platform is from the people who are criticizing it, the easier it is to be critical of it. So I think a lot of politicians, a lot of pundits got fairly comfortable with things like Twitter, things like Facebook. I think short video as a dominant mode of communication has been, for many people, well, that's what the kids do. That's not what serious people do. And so I saw a lot of people who you would hope would stand up for free speech, essentially saying, let it die. It's just contributing to brain rot. It's only being used by teenagers.
But that's even more reason to be outraged. I mean, I take your point. I think in a sense, perhaps you're right. But the fact that it's supposed to be this trivial media is even less reason to ban. I mean, ultimately, this comes down to paranoia about China, doesn't it? Or am I wrong?
So I think paranoia about China is the simplest version of it. I think it's also got a strong ingredient of paranoia about social media and addiction, a topic that you have certainly been interested in
Mm.
over the years. And then I think some of it is sheer dismissiveness. I think it's easier to ban something that people aren't using, aren't paying attention to. But let's lean into the China piece of this first and foremost. I think many people were surprised after Israel's invasion of Gaza how strong anti Israel sentiment and pro Palestinian sentiment was on a network like TikTok. And there was a great deal of speculation that maybe this was the moment where the Chinese government was putting their thumb on the scale and using social media to brainwash American teenagers into being anti Israel. Let me be clear, there's no good evidence that that's
Who
what
was
happened.
making that argument?
You saw that argument in the popular press. You saw that argument coming out in some of the senators who were talking about this is how the weaponization ultimately happens. So this was the fear, was that the algorithm controlled by the Chinese government could be used to shape public opinion. And Israel Palestine was the first case where people started saying, it seems like the opinions are deeply unbalanced coming off of this. My lab actually researches TikTok. We are well aware of the fact that it's actually a global majority platform. Yes, it's popular in the United States, but it's much more popular in Indonesia, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh. It's popular in a lot of places where people are certainly going to be inclined to support pro Palestinian content. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's a thumb on the scale by the Chinese government. This could simply be the mood of the people using the platform. But I agree with you. I think this became an excuse to channel fears about China's increasing strength around AI. And of course, as we've seen with the DeepSeek news recently, that fits into this larger narrative of, oh no, China's catching up. TikTok seems to be one of these places where they've actually outpaced us. TikTok's algorithm seems to work better than Facebook's or Meta's algorithm as far as Instagram Reels goes.
Yeah, and you mentioned DeepSeek, and now we have all this paranoia being shifted from DeepSeek, from TikTok to DeepSeek. ABC has a story which which it's reporting. It sounds highly absurd to me that apparently DeepSeek coding has the capability to transfer users' data directly to the Chinese government. It's another of the classic paranoid fears of the Chinese government. The London Independent is reporting that DeepSeek users in US could face $1 million fines, and the Australians are banning DeepSeek. They're already banning use of social media for people under 18. So are we going to see with DeepSeek, Ethan, chapter 2 in this hysteria against China?
It certainly seems possible. So let's just note Australia for a moment. Australia's been extremely aggressive. They have a youth ban on social media that I think to many of us it feels a bit overwrought. Feels maybe based more on the headlines than based on the science. But it is interesting to see this now turn into China fears as well.
Although it's worth noting that Australian-Chinese relations
Are
are
tense.
very complicated for geographical, cultural reasons. There's a long history of this tension and mutual suspicion.
But here's sort of a fascinating, for me, the perhaps fascinating way to look at this. For many years, we talked about the possibility of a splinter net, like this idea that there's
Someone even
no
wrote a
longer.
book. Who wrote that book, Splinter Net? I remember having him on the show. I can't remember his name.
There have been a number of good books around it. I found myself going back to it around Russia, when it looked like Russia was going to cut off access to YouTube as well as other American social media after the war with Ukraine. But now we're getting to the point where some of the cutting off is not closed societies like Russia and China. It's open societies like the United States and Australia. And it's very strange. The principles of an open society, generally speaking, are that you want your people to be able to have access to information. And this idea that being able to use a Chinese entertainment service, a Chinese, essentially AI-based search engine, is so dangerous that it must be banned at the top levels, seems utterly counter to how we've traditionally run our societies. I ended up writing in the Atlantic piece about a case in the United States in 1965, so well during the Cold War, where Americans were subscribing to Communist Party publications coming out of China. So explicit, flat out Chinese propaganda. And the US courts decided unanimously that the post office couldn't block access to this material by requiring people to say, yes, in fact, I did sign up for this. Yes, please give me this. In many ways, that court decision from 65 was a situation so much less restrictive than banning DeepSeek, than banning TikTok. In these cases, we're literally saying you cannot get the information at all, not just you had to jump through an extra hoop. So in the United States, over the course of 60 years, we've gone from no, we really have an unfettered right to information. We cannot get in the way of that to have a functioning democracy, to a willingness to block an awful lot of information, including a tool that is a primary source of information for many, many young people. It feels like a seismic shift. And I think I agree with you, Andrew. I don't understand where the outrage is, because I do think it's outrageous. A big
Yeah,
part of the outrage is that we're still using it, and that in and of itself is another interesting aspect of the story.
yeah, we'll get to that. And you and I haven't always agreed on everything over the years,
Sure.
but I think we share this outrage of banning a popular platform. I mean, some arguments are that somehow all these kids' videos are being used, manipulated by the Chinese government. There are all these hackers in Beijing or in some building somewhere getting into these kids' accounts, which sounds absurd to me. Ethan, you mentioned earlier the hysteria also about social media, which I agree with you about. You have people like Jonathan Haidt writing about banning social media for kids. How important do you think this is in TikTok? Has this weakened the progressive progressive sensibilities on this? Do some progressives say, well, social media is destroying our kids' minds, so it's not such a bad thing if TikTok gets banned?
So I think Haidt's book is very, very important as far as the public discourse. I don't think it's a great book in as much as I think the actual defensible parts of his argument, which are that there's some evidence that social media is having negative effects on some young women between 15 and 19. That's a pretty defensible argument. The way the book generally presents itself and is discussed is social media is bad and big things need to be done to counter it. And there's just not terrific evidence that social media has negative effects on the vast majority of people. Most of the big N studies show very little correlation at all. But the Haidt book, I think you're right, gave argument to some progressives to essentially say, maybe it's time to protect the kids from social media. On the right, you've had various different arguments that social media is yet another institution biased against the right. It's yet another institution where the left has captured it and where censorship is going on. But I teach a course called Fixing Social Media, Andrew, and I opened the course on Monday by showing the picture of all these tech CEOs sitting behind Trump at the inauguration. And then I showed a headline from a year before, which shows Mark Zuckerberg in front of Congress, flanked by many of the same tech CEOs. And the headline says, your companies have blood on their hands. And it's an argument from a Republican senator that these platforms are driving children to suicide and literally killing kids. And there's not very good evidence for that as well. But I think that argument has gotten enough traction with enough on the left and the right that we were able to, have Congress vote for this TikTok ban. This is legislation that was proposed under Trump. It got taken up by Biden. It got passed by a majority of Congress. And now, of course, the strangest bit of this is it's not being enforced. I'm on TikTok every day. I quite enjoy it, actually. And it is fully accessible. There are problems installing it from the Google and the Apple stores, as they may have concerns about being lawbreakers involved with this. But this is now the final twist in all of this is we had a bad law. We had a law that, as you pointed out, some people are now ashamed that they supported, and now we have a government that's also ignoring the law.
Yeah, it's an astonishing situation in an astonishing moment. What about the generational quality, Ethan? You teach at college. Could this manifest itself? You mentioned the Gaza-Palestine issue on TikTok, which tended to be manifested by younger people. Could this trigger a new kind of generational conflict of young people against older supposed progressives like Jonathan Haidt, Richard Reeves, all these types of powerful intellectual voices in Washington, D.C. and top universities who are telling the kids really what they should and shouldn't do?
I think the TikTok ban is great evidence for many young people that figures of authority have no idea what they're talking about. I think it's very easy to be cynical about a lot of institutions in the world today. And I think the TikTok ban is a reason to be very cynical. My students have some anxieties about social media. The anxieties tend to be about how they spend their time. The aspect of social media that they tend to resonate the most with is the idea of dark patterns, the idea that these sites are actually quite well designed to capture lots of your time. They're very interested in finding ways to control their own time and control their own attention. But this idea that TikTok is somehow steering them to one political view or another, I think to most of my students seems absurd, and also seems delusional, given that we've got broadcast media that is explicitly propaganda, sort of in one direction or another. So for a lot of my students, this is just evidence that what's going on in legislatures has very little understanding of what's actually going on the ground. I actually thought young people using TikTok had this just wonderful response in deciding that they were going to flee en masse to Red Note. And either you could look at this and say, oh my God, they're so dumb that they're leaving a Chinese platform for another Chinese platform that's going to get blocked. But if you looked at the larger context, you can see what they were actually doing. They were laughing at the US government. You want to block one Chinese platform, fine, we'll go to another one. Of course we know it's monitored. You had this whole wave of people on TikTok waving goodbye to their Chinese spy and saying, you knew me better than I knew myself. Basically people saying, look, we get that what this is anti-China sentiment, economic protectionism, and grandstanding. And, we are the casualties in all of this, the enjoyment that we had in these platforms, the communities that we formed. Congress doesn't care at all about that, and they don't care about us. And so, what would be better than showing them how little we care than just going to another Chinese controlled platform?
Ethan, your last book was called Mistrust: Why Losing Faith in Institutions Provides the Tools to Transform Them. All sorts of stories. I mean, I'm not quite sure how low trust will go at the moment, but there are more and more fears of a shutdown as the Trump battles continue. One Washington top Democrat in Congress suggests that the level of trust is at the lowest I've ever seen it here in Congress, which that's the kind of thing you hear every week. What's your take as someone who's written a book about mistrust and our current predicament? especially when it comes to what we can and can't, what we legally can and can't do on the internet?
So I was writing Mistrust during the first Trump administration. And what I was seeing before Trump came into power were many, many young people in my life telling me that they had very low confidence in institutions of all sort. Not only did they have very little trust in the government, they had little trust in media, they had little trust in big business. And
did that translate also into mistrust in you? Are those kids of yours or students?
So I think both. So I think the interesting thing to distinguish is institutional mistrust versus individual mistrust. Americans are actually quite trusting of one another as people. We're even fairly trusting of, sort of strangers in the abstract compared to many other societies. What we don't like are institutions, anything that sort of works based on a system of rules rather than based on individuals and their ability to make personal discretion. And so I think Trump really sort of benefited from this in the first presidency. There was this idea that, well, we have an individual rather than, someone who's working within a system. Maybe he as an individual will be able to do something and make some changes. I think Americans, in many ways, said, well, that was not such a great way to do things. This is perhaps not the most competent individual. Maybe we actually do need to support these institutions. And I think Joe Biden was an institutionalist turn. I think, unfortunately, running a campaign first for Joe Biden, who looked manifestly unfit to lead, and then having a Kamala Harris campaign that essentially says, no, everything's fine, we'll just keep going in this way, ignored the underlying mistrust. I think an enormous number of people still feel like many institutions in the United States are not working well. And I think this explains how we got Trump and now this sort of super empowered Trump armed with Elon. I think the young people that I'm seeing are trying to figure out how this is going to affect them day to day. They're worried for friends who are coming from other countries. They worry for queer friends. They worry about what's happening at their academic institutions. I think none of this is about trusting that, if Congress or if the Democrats could just get their hands back on the wheel, everything will be okay. I think there's very low trust in those institutions. But I think now what we're realizing is that a super empowered individual, a president who is not bound by norms or perhaps even by laws, can do a whole lot of damage very, very quickly. My guess is that we'll have a certain amount of enthusiasm for institutions that actually work. But I think for a lot of my students, they haven't really seen an America where those institutions are working particularly well. They don't necessarily have a model to imagine going back to. The Biden administration, might not have been a particularly compelling model.
Do you have a model of something to go back to?
I mean, I think I'm looking very fondly back on the Obama years. But when I look at the Obama years from a left point of view, Andrew, I still see enormous rising inequality. For me, the funny thing is some of the post-war period, some of the post-World War II period had enormous public investment and enormous redistribution of wealth. When we think of the sort of infrastructure building of the 1950s, some of that was happening with 90% marginal tax rates on the rich. And I think looking at inequality as one of the fundamental issues in all of this, if we could go back to building public goods, trying to level some of the economic inequality, and do it without the endemic racism and sexism that was happening in the 50s and that we finally started dealing with in the 60s, maybe that's not actually the worst moment to look at. I just fear that when we look backwards, we tend to look backwards with a very specific historic lens. And of course, at the moment, we appear to be looking backwards to the 1890s, which is probably not a especially healthy moment of both robber barons and high tariffs.
Ethan, at the beginning of this conversation, you described yourself as a progressive. There is a a school of progressives, particularly theorists, the Frankfurt School, and others, you're all too familiar with them, who always argued that democracy was a bit of a sham, that all this promise of freedom of speech was, if not a lie, was a veil to the reality of inequality, class exploitation, capitalism, blah, blah, blah. Is what's happening now, particularly on the internet, the banning of platforms and technologies that we choose not to like, does that prove that some progressives were actually right about their critique of democracy and freedom?
So I think there's a lot of different strains in the progressive movement that we could pick up. And when I look at the progressive movement, I'm much more interested in strains that essentially invented investigative journalism as a way of trying to look at corporate power in the early 20th century and ensured a secret ballot and ballot measures so that you had more democratic control rather than the power of super empowered political parties. What's tricky about all of this, of course, is you also got lower participation at those moments when you had this very demanding form of citizenship. Read the newspaper, sort of figure out what's going on. You actually saw democratic participation rates go down. And I think some of those critiques that you're talking about basically ask the question, is democracy too hard? Are we really able to rule ourselves? I think democracy, as my friend Astra Taylor puts it, it may never have existed, but we'll miss it when it's gone.
Yeah.
I think it's an aspiration that we have to continue fighting for. I have very little sympathy for these Curtis Yarvin style new monarchists. I think
I'm not surprised.
Anyone who's advocating for this sort of monarchy tends to imagine that they will be part of that ruling class, and that to me seems racist, elitist, any number of different sorts of ists.
Although that guy Ethan, and I don't want to get lost and go down one of his holes, but he could be someone out of Monty Python. We live in such odd times that you have some odd fellow from quote unquote the internet talking about restoring monarchy, and people are taking him seriously, and he has profiles in the New York Times. It's very odd.
The New York Times profile was one of the strangest things I can imagine. I subscribe to the Times, I read the Times, I listen to the Times, and he showed up as the weekly interview, and I had to check myself. Wait a second, are we talking about Mencius Moldbug? I mean, this guy has been writing online as part of the intellectual dark web, and he's sort of been at the quite odd and dangerous fringes, and the idea that he's now sort of showing up as a major figure in our dialogue. Yes, these are.
I did warn you 20 years ago, the cult of the amateur, this kind of thing would happen. I don't think you believed me then. You might be more on my page now.
You and I go back and forth and in and out on.
Yeah, and I've come over to your side. I'm curious also, Ethan. Later this week, I'm interviewing Eon Higgins, who has a new book out, Owned: How Tech Billionaires on the Right bought the loudest voices on the left. And Higgins argues that guys like Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald have essentially been bought by people like Musk and Andreessen and Peter Thiel. You watch this space quite carefully. What do you make of people like Greenwald and Taibbi?
So I do think there's a way in which being a journalist forces you to be skeptical. You're forced to look at things and say, do I really believe this? What are the powers sort of competing for my attention in all of this? And I think in particular, if you are a journalist, you are critical about these things, you run this risk that your criticality at some point takes you to conspiracy. And I've seen this happen to many smart people at different moments in time. I think that line between criticality and conspiracy isn't explored enough. I actually think maybe my favorite person on this is Sarah Kendzior.
Yeah, who's going
Who,
to be on? She has a new book out. She's actually going to be on the show in a couple of months. She's been on the
and
show. She's
let me
excellent.
just say, she's magnificent. She's really.
And I don't know if you've seen her book. It's out. I think it's April, first week of April. It's her road tour of the U.S. It's
So
her at her best. It's very well written.
And I'm not at all surprised. And amusingly enough, I was on my road tour of the American Midwest, which I do every summer, and that's the last time we saw each other, actually, for coffee in St. Louis. But she makes this argument that essentially, before you demonstrate that malfeasance is going on, you are in fact a conspiracy theorist. You are positing a conspiracy, and then you as a journalist have to sort of demonstrate that those things happen. So I do think there's a sense in which Greenwald, who broke some very important stories and a very important critical voice, may have sort of leaned over to the point where now his assumption is to disbelieve all sorts of power. And I think it is possible to sort of fall over that edge. I think living on that edge where you are looking at the conspiracies is an interesting one. I think it's too easy to sort of accuse people of being bought and of selling out in that fashion. I actually think this notion of I've seen a lot of things, I'm inclined to believe that power is capable of lots of different things, might send someone in some strange directions. I do think there's also this way in which being contrary, looking for the hidden narrative is a very secure way of seeking attention. And when I look at someone like a Joe Rogan, I find myself wondering whether in sort of being driven towards the attention and getting incredibly good at sort of driving these things, he came from sort of a libertarian left view into now this, very tightly aligned right MAGA view. And I wonder if there's a way of chasing audience that probably is applicable there. But then again, I think that audience has also sort of moved to him at the same process. So it is very hard to know. Is there a way in which following the attention is going to take you maybe off of that journalistic skepticism and sort of over into the conspiracy side of things?
So what are we going to do about this? You wrote an interesting op-ed in the New York Times last May. I love Facebook. That's why I'm suing Meta. You've got this it was a high profile case against Meta on internet freedom. Can this be done through law? Tell us about why you sued Meta.
Sure. So let's back up, and then I'll sort of update you on all of this. I am interested in giving people more control over their social media. And I was very interested in a piece of software developed by a friend of mine named Louis Barclay, which let you automatically unfollow everyone on Facebook. So it basically took something that you could do manually. You could go into Facebook and just unfollow all of your friends. And what it will do is empty out your news feed. If you want to find your friends, you have to actually remember to go look at them. It tends to make people use Facebook less. Louis developed this tool. Meta said, you can't release this tool. We will seek legal remedies against you. And by the way, Louis, because you're in the UK, you've signed into an agreement where not only are you going to lose in court, but you'll end up paying all of our Meta legal fees. I thought that was lousy. I thought unfollow everyone should be allowed.
Why were they against it, Facebook? Because they didn't want people to unfollow, or because they didn't want people interfering in their algorithm?
They don't like people interfacing through Facebook with a third-party tool. So there's a family of tools that are starting to be called middleware. Middleware is a tool that allows
France, and you wrote an interesting piece in that op-ed. You talked about Fukuyama, who was on the show a few weeks ago, and his theory of middleware.
The idea behind middleware is that if you don't like how a platform is operating, You can ban it, as the US seems to be inclined to do. You can try to make it follow your rules, as the EU has been trying to do with things like GDPR, must tell us about how you're using data, so on and so forth. Frank's take on this is maybe there could be a commercial intervention. Maybe there could be another software tool. You use that software tool and you can make social media behave a bit differently. And unfollow is a great example of this. If you used unfollow, you could make Facebook behave differently. Facebook does not like being told what to do. And so, hence the legal threats. They don't want people writing software that interfaces with Facebook. They're worried it could lead to another Cambridge Analytica. It doesn't matter whether the software is quite innocent. They're quite aggressive about it.
Is this the sort of the TweetDeck problem?
It's very similar to TweetDeck. So TweetDeck is a form of middleware. It's a custom client that allowed you to use Twitter in a very particular sort of way. But there's other examples of middleware. There's a wonderful program called Block Party, which Tracy Chow created as a way of helping people deal with online harassment. And it made Twitter much more usable for people who are experiencing a lot of harassment. And then Twitter essentially said, look, we're going to charge so much for our API, you simply can't do this anymore. So middleware is an approach that a lot of people are trying, a lot of the platforms dislike. And so I looked at this and said, look, Louis tried to build this tool. If I build this tool in the US, they're going to do to me the same thing that they did to Louis. I'm going to go to the courts and say, look, I have a really good reason for building this tool. I think it's going to be interesting. I want to do an academic study on it. Please, US federal court, will you give me permission to go ahead and build this tool? The federal court said, look, we cannot rule on this until you actually have the tool in hand. And so I'm now going through the process of writing this tool. So along with some software developers, we're going through the very difficult process of making a tool to automate behavior on Facebook. And I will say Facebook makes this very, very challenging. You can't just write code that says log onto Facebook and press this button. Facebook has many levels of sort of security and obscurity trying to prevent you from doing this.
Ethan Zuckerman not giving you had an interesting piece in Prospect recently about you're not willing to give Meta the benefit of the doubt. So now you are, in a sense, out-metering Meta.
I would certainly not say that I'm out-metaing Meta. I'm trying to
Well, you're trying to give your stamp into Meta. Why not just create your own search engine or social media platform?
Because 3 billion people are already using this thing. And it's very, very hard to replace those network effects. Look, I use Facebook. I use Facebook in no small part because my sister uses Facebook and it's the best place to see photos of my niece and nephew. But I would really prefer that Meta not push particular accounts at me, that I'm simply able to connect with the people that I chose to connect with. And I feel like I should have that ability to do it within their interface. And I think legally, once you have a platform that is big enough that it's very, very hard to unseat, you might actually have a legal right to be able to interface with these sorts of platforms. So that's the challenge that I'm trying to take on in court. Meta makes it very difficult. That's fine. I think we're going to go ahead and write these things. Let's be clear. My tool doesn't make me any money. All it lets me do is essentially change something that I think should be on the Meta settings bar. I think you should be able to say to Meta, please don't suggest accounts to me. Just give me the accounts that I follow. I think that should be a checkbox. Because it is not a checkbox, I am involved in a legal battle.
Yeah, and it makes Meta or Facebook's boasts about open source AI particularly absurd. Fukuyama seems to think that we need to save democracy from technology. He authored a piece in Foreign Affairs recently. I've talked to him about it through this middleware.
Yep.
Does this suggest to me, Ethan, that the promise or the dream of Web3 is just dead? Because a few years ago, we were talking about distributed networks, social platforms, post-Facebook, post-Twitter, in which none of these things would be problems. And it all sounded good in theory. all powered by the blockchain. Does what's happening now underline the fact that Web3 was just an idealistic dream, totally unrealistic?
So I've never been a Web3 guy because Web3 very much was based around blockchain. And to me, blockchain is a very slow, very expensive database that mostly seems to be used by pyramid schemers. So the notion that somehow there would be a blockchain solution to this has never been very appealing to me. I will say there's an interesting note on all of this, which is that one of the projects out there that has embraced blockchain as sort of a post Facebook way of looking at things is Project Liberty, and that's Frank McCourt, who is a US
who's been on the show. But do you trust him?
No, not in the least. And I think his attempts in all of this are I think with very good intentions, but I think he's drunk all of the blockchain Kool-Aid. He's one of the figures now being talked about for buying TikTok. His hope to buy TikTok for 20 billion, which does seem a little underpriced, is that he would throw out the algorithm. He just wants to buy 170 million users and try to get them over to a system. Right now, the only system that's sort of using the Project Liberty blockchain is MeWe, which is a social network that, unless you're really down in the weeds, you probably haven't heard about, because it really has not mostly caught on. What I will say is that decentralization, which was part of the blockchain idea, is seeming to get some enthusiasm. So Mastodon continues to grow slowly but steadily. Blue Sky seems to be a place where a lot of people fleeing Meta products after Zuckerberg's right-wing turn seem to be coming onto Blue Sky.
And of course, X.
And of course, X, obviously. Yeah, X, yes. Blue Sky has an architecture that supports decentralization. There's now a movement to try to raise money to create another Blue Sky server that isn't controlled by Blue Sky. That's probably in the long run a good idea. Blue Sky is doing some of the things similar to what I've been trying to do in some of my projects, which is giving people control over the algorithms that they use to browse social media. Blue Sky has this notion of custom feeds where you can start having more control over what you're starting to see. So I do think as Musk and now Zuckerberg do their right-wing turns, there are some people essentially saying, look, I'm not comfortable with the politics of these highly centralized networks. Maybe I can move to something that feels a bit better. It is actually really a tribute to just how powerful these networks are, Andrew. I think you have a lot of people saying, I don't want to support Zuckerberg supporting Trump and Musk, but I also don't want to lose my friends. And it is really interesting to think about just how much gravity these networks have. I still have accounts on Facebook and on X. I'm not willing to give up reading those people, even if most of my writing these days is on Mastodon and on Blue Sky.
Finally, Ethan, what are we supposed to do in a meta sense with a small m, not the big M? You had an interesting piece in Prospect recently on the Amish approach to AI. Are you turning away from technology? You look a bit like an Amish. I'm not sure you are one.
I will say we have lovely Mennonite neighbors out here in Western Massachusetts, and I have enormous respect for how they run their lives and their society. But no, I am unlikely anytime soon to make a particular turn away from technology. No, that piece looked at this notion that Amish communities are very selective about what technologies they pick up. And it was trying to make this argument that trying to cram large language models into everything seemed like a very poor idea, and that maybe we could be a lot more selective in AI. And actually, one of the things I wrote about in that piece was an AI that I've actually enjoyed using, which is Google's Notebook LM.
Yeah,
which
an
is
excellent thing.
it's a wonderful thing. You actually hand it a set of articles and you say, look, I'd like some answers, but I'd like them restricted just to these articles. And I talked about a little experiment I'd done. I fed a few research articles I'd done to it. I asked it questions about my own research. And then I asked the question, are frogs amphibians? And the model came back and said, I can't tell you that based on these papers. These are papers about social networks. They don't talk about biology, and so I don't have the answer. And that I don't have the answer was actually the most positive thing I've seen from an AI recently. The trick with ChatGPT, the trick with DeepSeek is that it will feed you very convincing bullshit, even if it does not know the answer. What it will not tell you is, I don't know. But I don't know is a really important thing for people to say. Andrew, if your next question is going to be about politics in South Sudan, I'm going to tell you I don't know because I'm just not up on that subject at the moment. And this is one of the things that we should worry about the most with AI. AI doesn't want to tell you, I don't know. And actually, I don't know is often the most important thing to be able to say.
Well, that's a good way of ending. Ethan Zuckerman, I don't know. I mean, what was the Rumsfeld thing? It's I don't know what I don't know.
The known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. Yeah.
One of the wise men of the digital revolution. You still have some faith, Ethan, right? You still believe you're not trashing your smartphone. You're not getting off the platforms. You still have an inkling of belief that all this technology can make the world a better place.
I still teach a course called Fixing Social Media. And I wouldn't teach that course if I didn't feel like there was something worth fixing and that it was fixable. But I do have to say, weeks like this one, months like this one, some days it's harder than others, but it is always a pleasure to talk with a critical shark mind like yours, Andrew. So it's always enjoyable.
Well, vice versa. Ethan Zuckerman, author, America is no longer the home of the free internet. Very worrying piece in the Atlantic. We'll get you back on the show in the not too distant future, Ethan, one of the most trustworthy voices on digital in our age of mistrust. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Good to talk to you.
Can I step on the sea?